Jack, thank you very much. And guys, great to see you all here. Let me begin with an apt and topical quotation. Try and guess the year. Almighty God uses thunder, lightning, and other blows which issue from his throne to scourge the sons whom he wishes to redeem. Accordingly, since a catastrophic pestilence from the east has arrived in a neighboring kingdom, it is very much feared that unless we pray devoutly and incessantly, a similar pestilence will stretch its poisonous branches into this realm and strike down and consume the inhabitants. Any guesses as to when that was? I'll give you a clue. It wasn't recent. It was August 1348. Bishop of Bath writing to his priests in advance of the first visitation of the plague. Now, on that occasion, about half the population didn't survive. Okay? I'm just asking for a bit of perspective here. The central expectation of the government is that 100,000 people may die, including those who would have died of seasonal flu. That is a big number, and each of those people is as much the center of his or her own universe as you are. Each of those deaths will be a tragedy. But just think of the changes in our country in the intervening centuries. We're now talking about less than half of 1% of the population, rather than 50% of the population. Right? And by the way, there were numerous recurrences of plague, all of them lethal, all of them devastating. Right? Things have got better. Cheer up, right? Even at a time like this, just have enough sense of proportion. And ask yourself, when might you rather have been alive than now? Now, I realize that the point I am making is counterintuitive. It's much more popular, and it's much easier to rail against all the things you don't like, and to say that the world is on the point of collapse and we face some looming cataclysm, right? We have all these idealistic young people in Extinction Rebellion, dressing up in funny clothes and smearing themselves with blood and lying down and making a nuisance of themselves, supposedly because we have never seen such terrible natural disasters as today. The planet is burning, we're being told. Billions of people risk losing their lives. But again, just look at the figures. According to the United Nations, in 2019, 11,000 people globally were victims of natural disasters. To put that figure in context, in 1931, when the global population was about a quarter of what it now is, the total number of people who died in natural disasters was 3.7 million. Now, it's not because we have become a hardier species. It's because civilization has advanced, and poverty, which was the most vulnerable condition in which to meet some natural cataclysm, has declined sharply over the last 20 years. And why has it done that? Because the bits of the world which used to have the most closed and controlled and autarkic economies have opened up and embraced global trade, global markets. And that's really what I want to focus on tonight, the extraordinary miracle whose after effects we are still experiencing, that elevated the individual above the collective and unlocked riches which our ancestors could hardly have dreamed of. Come in, ladies and gentlemen, come in, have a seat. If I think of the changes just in my lifetime, don't worry about going back to 1348, right? I was born in 1971. If I think of what's changed just in the years that I've been on this planet. 1971, the year of my birth, it took the average worker more than 2 months to be able to earn enough to buy a TV set. Now it's less than 3 days. In 1971, fewer than half of girls in the world got any education beyond the age of 11. Now it's more than 90%. In 1971, a car moving at in 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car today moving at full speed. You can take almost any measure, literacy, longevity, infant mortality, calorie intake, height. We've never lived better, longer, more fulfilled lives than we do now. And it's worth clinging on to that elemental truth as we go through these times of panic and crisis. It's a very alarming thing about the reaction to the virus is that, if you like, it triggers our primal fight or flight index, our response, which makes us want to draw up the drawbridges, makes us want to hunker down. And in a modern political context, that translates into being protectionist. People being inward-looking, stop foreign flights arriving, and stop. Why are we so dependent on importing things from China, and shouldn't we be doing more ourselves? And all of these things on a sort of primeval level seem to make sense, but none of them is true. None of them works. Let's just take the idea, which is now growing on left and right, that the coronavirus is the end of globalization. It's shown that we've reached the limit of extended supply chains. We're overexposed to imports from this or that regime. Do you know, the idea that you should be self-sufficient, that you should grow your own food, and that you should be largely able to supply your own needs, was for a long time the goal of policy in most countries. Right? And it coincided with regular famines. Because if you are trying to grow all of your own food, you are vulnerable to local disruption, to one bad harvest or one freak event. And that actually the way to have real food security is to buy from a diverse and varied group of global suppliers, because the chances of something going disastrously wrong all over the world at the same moment is very small. That is a counterintuitive notion, right? Difficult idea for people. And it took until the 60s before most governments embraced it, which is why it's only since then that we've seen this huge decline in the number of famines. And the only place on the planet today that you still see regular man-made hunger is North Korea, which is the one place that has stayed outside of the global markets, the one place that has, if you like, pursued that policy of self-sufficiency to its logical conclusion. In Korea, it's called Juche, self-reliance, being elevated as the ruling principle, right? Opposite end of the scale from North Korea, somewhere like Singapore. Doesn't grow any food, doesn't even have its own water, has to import its water, its food, its electricity, right? Where would you rather live? Right? It is a counterintuitive notion. And by that I mean it in the literal sense. Free markets run up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genome. Right? The protectionist case, the mercantilist case, rests on a series of assertions that sound completely plausible, but that in fact turn out to be specious. So whether it's in Beijing or in Brussels or in Washington, when a politician says something like, we can't carry on with a trade deficit like this, or we need to protect our strategic industries, or we can't compete with slave wage economies, or indeed, we need to grow more of our own food, those things sound completely reasonable. It's just that they all end up making you poorer. And to understand why they make us poorer, we need an element of education, right? Because these are not intuitive ideas. No one is born understanding free markets. We all have to learn. We have to learn why our inherited rules of thumb, our hunches, what psychologists call our heuristics, often don't apply to the real world, right? The reason why we all get nervous when we're told that Britain has to import nearly half of its food is because deep down, our inner caveman is deeply unhappy with the idea of relying on strangers who he can't see. We all carry this Paleolithic instinct to provide against famine by hoarding food, right? It's just that that doesn't really translate very well into a world of superabundance and skyscrapers. If you like, it's a misfiring. And to understand why that's a neural misfiring, to understand why we need to embrace policies that feel wrong, that seem not to be common sense, requires a modicum of education. The exact sense of drawing people out, educare, making people understand things that don't come naturally. Now, what's it really based on, this miracle of wealth and superabundance that we have? What's the key? I mean, we carried on being very, very poor as a species pretty much from the invention of farming until an eye blink ago, until maybe 200 years ago. The great economic historian Deirdre McCluskey calls this the Great Enrichment. She points out that until about 1800, almost everyone on the planet, unless they happened to be a great emperor, lived on $3 a day or less. Since 1800, at the most conservative estimate, there has been something like a 3,000% increase in living standards for most people. So basically our lot was poverty until a moment ago when something quite extraordinary happened. But I can see some of you are still skeptical about that 3,000% figure, so think about it like this. The most powerful man in the world in the 17th century was the King of France, the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil, King Louis. And as a sign of his wealth and his power, every night he would have prepared for him 40 different dishes. And he would decide which one he wanted for his supper. That one, he'd have 4 people to feed it to him. Right? Think about this. Any one of you could stop at a Tesco Metro now, and you would have a wider range of choice than Louis XIV had. And the food would be fresher and healthier and more diverse. Every one of us now is living better than the greatest and richest man in the world in the early modern period. Right? And we're not just eating better, right? We're less likely to die in childbirth, we're more literate, we carry around information that was beyond the dreams of people in those days. Plucking 2 random headlines from the last month. A man paralyzed since birth in the United States is now walking with a mind-controlled exoskeleton. And scientists at the University of Waterloo have effectively invented what I can best describe as an artificial leaf, a chemical process that sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere and turns it into energy. It's something you'd think the Greenies would be really delighted about, right? But they won't be. They'll be as grumpy about that as they are about everything else. We are wielding powers that previous generations attributed to gods and wizards, and yet we are the grumpiest and most ungrateful generation ever to have existed because we are attacking the thing that made that happen, namely the removal of barriers, the spread of markets, and the unlocking of human potential. There was a Conservative Prime Minister in the interwar period, most of the interwar period, Stanley Baldwin. Very successful guy, very patriotic guy, decent fellow. Privately gave 1/5 of his money away to help repay the debt that we'd incurred winning the First World War. Towards the end of his life, he was interviewed and he was asked, had he been influenced by any particular theorist or any particular philosopher? Now, Baldwin was not the kind of guy who read books. He was a very practical, unideological, undoctrinaire kind of conservative. But rather to the astonishment of the interviewer, he said, actually, yes, I was. I was very influenced as a young man by the work of Sir Henry Maine, the great Victorian jurist and historian, I suppose. And he said, it was only by reading the works of Maine that I came to understand that all human history is a move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? Now, it's a cute story because it illustrates how even the most brilliant ideas become worn through use. Even the most original insight ends up becoming a cliche. But I want all of you just to spend a second thinking about those 3 words, status to contract. For almost the whole of human history, human relations were mediated by birth, caste, tradition. The breakthrough, the key that unlocked that great enrichment since the beginning of the 19th century was the simplest thing. It was the idea that 2 people could come together and make a contract autonomously as free individuals without needing to ask anyone's permission. It sounds so small when you say it like that. And yet, that was the beginning of the revolution that has led to the Starbucks and the Starships and the smallpox vaccines and the symphonies and all of the other miracles of modernity. Status to contract. About 10,000 years ago, the first of our ancestors made the startling discovery that if you put seeds in the ground, plants will grow there. Agriculture seems to have been invented on at least 4, possibly as many as 6 or 7 different occasions in the current interglacial period. In China, in the Middle East, by the Aztecs, by the Incas, and possibly also in Papua New Guinea. Great invention. But my guess is that it took about 5 minutes for the next invention, or the next discovery, let's say, which is that it is a better use of your resources to steal your neighbor's harvest than to spend all year growing your own crops. We are a competitive and rapacious species. And then came the really dire breakthrough, which is that if you truly want to optimize the ratio of effort to outcome, the best thing of all is to regularize that plunder through a series of tithes and tolls and taxes. And thus was civilization born as a protection racket. In the first cities, the first writing, the things that we take as the beginning of human history, there was another institution that was universal, which was slavery. It was how every economy worked. It was practiced in every age, on every continent, until an eye blink ago. It was practiced by the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas, by Arabs and Africans and Chinese and Japanese, by Australian Aboriginals, by every kind of European and Near Eastern civilization. Every single one of you here is descended from slaves. Every single one of you here, incidentally, is also descended from slave owners. If you think about human history, it could hardly be otherwise. Just a question of how far back you want to go. Until the magical breakthrough, status to contract. We hardly think of the misery that was involved in the run-up to that. You look at the great artifacts of those early civilizations, the pyramids, the Pergamum Gate, the great ziggurats of Central America. Think about the agony and bondage that went into the construction of every one of those museum artifacts at which we marvel today. The Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht once wrote a poem called A Worker Reads History. A worker reads history. It begins, who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone and Babylon so many times destroyed? Who raised it up again each time? Go back and look at the history of those early Bronze Age and Iron Age slave emperors, right? Or indeed read the accounts in the Old Testament. See how many times you read about a king raising this or that city. Now stop for a moment and think about everything that is implied by that word. All the human anguish and agony implied by those 3 words, right? We are so fortunate to be living in a time and a place where we have moved from a form of extractive government to a form of controlled government. A system where more or less we have mechanisms at our disposal to hold our rulers to account. Under every civilization before modern capitalism, under every other economic system, the way that you got rich was to join the plunderers rather than the slaves. Under every other system, whether it was an Iron Age slave empire or a medieval European monarchy or the pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, or indeed a post-colonial African kleptocracy or a communist system during the Cold War, under every other system, a gang of people would take power, use power to plunder the assets of the state, and then rig the rules so that their kids could inherit the same privileges that they had had. Ours is the first system that allows you to prosper not by sucking up to those in power, not by trying to join the kings or the priests or the commissars or whatever ruling group there is, but by offering a service to everybody around you on the basis of free exchange, on the basis of free contract. The great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter once said, "The achievement of capitalism is not to provide more silk stockings for princesses. It's to bring them within the reach of shopgirls." No other system works by delivering for ordinary people. Our country was the one that pioneered it. We should all be very proud to think of what was done first here. We pioneered it in theory with the works of Adam Smith and then David Ricardo. We pioneered it in practice. In the 19th century, we became the first country to practice proper free trade, to take away all of the obstacles that existed between our population and the things they wanted to buy. And we became by far the richest country in the world. Until others started copying us and catching up, which was, by the way, great for us, right? We wanted to have rich neighbors. Rich neighbors make the best customers. If you look at the observations of almost any foreign visitor to Victorian England, the thing that strikes them before anything else is the level of wealth enjoyed by working people. First time anywhere on the planet that people on low incomes could afford watches and more than one suit of clothes and glass windows and cutlery and porcelain. It had never happened anywhere before on the planet. Right? We reached that wealth not through industrial strategies, not through backing favored industries, simply by inviting the traffic and commerce of the world without putting barriers in its way. Same formula that made Hong Kong and Singapore so rich in the 20th century, the same one being pursued by Australia and New Zealand today, and the same, as I hope, that we will pursue as an independent country as soon as we are fully out of the EU's trading arrangements at the end of this year. Here's the point that I want you to take away. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions. But all of the things that I've been saying are, in the exact sense of the word, counterintuitive. None of the things that I've been talking about comes naturally. Let me give you the example of, I cited David Ricardo as the great free trader. Right? David Ricardo came out with, I think, the single most brilliant insight, aperçu in economics. He proved mathematically that trading with a country, however much more competitive it is than you, is always in the interests of both parties. Right? That is a really deeply counterintuitive idea. I can remember when I was a student, somebody showing me the example of how this worked. And I thought, well, hang on, wait a minute, this can't be true. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that China is more efficient, more competitive, more productive than us at everything it does. Sure, I can see how free trade with us helps them, but how could it possibly help us? And I remember reading through Ricardo's argument and thinking, actually, this is logically unarguable. It's not just something that he shows to be true in practice, it's something that he shows has to be true through mathematics. The economist Paul Samuelson once said, it's the only idea in the whole of economics that is both surprising and true. Right? But it does not come naturally, not to a single person. And the function of a university, particularly, is to teach people those things that don't come naturally. It's to teach people the ideas that are counterintuitive, the ideas that don't align with our inherited heuristics. And up at the top of that set of unlikely or difficult ideas is the idea that people we don't like might still have useful things to say. The idea, in other words, that, if you like status to contract, that we are all individuals. The idea that every one of us is defined by our actions, our behavior, and our relationship with other people, rather than by accident of birth, which was how we used to think in pre-modern times. And these are, as I say, difficult ideas, because we evolved in kin groups, we evolved in tribes. We're not designed for abstract thought. We're not designed for ethical debate. We're designed to operate on the much older and simpler rule of thumb, my tribe good, your tribe bad. Right? We are designed for an altogether bloodier past on the grand savannas of Pleistocene Africa. So the function of all education should be to say, you know what? You are an individual, you have to make your own decisions, and how you are judged and your merit, your place in the world will be determined by that, not by some accident of physiognomy or inheritance. Now let's just ask, are universities doing that? Are universities teaching us to elevate the individual over the collective? Are they teaching us the wonder of breaking out of collectivism and unlocking the potential of modernity? Or are they not doing precisely the opposite? Instead of teaching, if you like, counter-cyclically, instead of teaching us the difficult ideas that we're not tribal creatures, and that the people on the other tribe may have a valid point of view, it seems to me that certainly in tertiary education, and increasingly also in secondary education, we are encouraging our young people to think in precisely converse terms. We're telling them that actually the only important thing about them is whether they're black or white, or whether they're gay or straight, or whether they're male or female. In other words, we're denying their capacity as free agents. We're denying the individualism that is the basis of the Enlightenment and the secret of modernity. I remember as a kid, a friend of my parents being unspeakably rude to a young French-Canadian couple that he'd just met. And afterwards, my mother ticked him off and said, why were you so unpleasant? You'd never met them before. And he said, oh, I knew French-Canadians during the war. I know what they're like. And I remember even then thinking, well, hang on, but that wasn't them, right? Whatever you had against French-Canadians during the war, it wasn't those people. Surely, and yet, a great deal of what is now the almost obligatory ideology on campus is based around this rather superstitious idea that if somebody did something bad to somebody else, even if it was before any of us was born, then you who have a vague resemblance to the exploiter owe something to him who has a vague resemblance to the exploited. Now, when you put it like that, it sounds like voodoo, right? And yet, under all the talk of intersectionality and power structures and hierarchy and patriarchy, that's basically what we're coming at. It's a ridiculous idea that we are, in fact, defined in the most superficial way. And I think if you're going to argue that, we should confront the exponents of that system with the consequences, the logical extreme of where they're taking us. In one of the states of Brazil, there was an affirmative action program in university. Of course, Brazil, very mingled population, lots of diverse ethnic groups. And it was decided that the people who were taking advantage of the affirmative action program were not black enough. They may have had a black grandparent, but they didn't look black enough. And so, and I'm not making this up, the authorities in that province said, we need to define what qualifies as phenotypically black, was the word they used. Right? Your hair has to be this curly. Your nose has to be this wide. Now, I'm guessing that almost all of you listening to that immediately recoil. How on earth can we be doing that? This is, and yet, is it really so different from any other ideology that elevates these random differences of ethnicity over the character and behavior of the individual? See, what I'm really saying is this. When we come across these bizarre stories, this strange affliction that has taken over in the last 5 years, all over campus, expressed in its safe spaces and its cultural appropriations and its trigger warnings and its microaggressions, but always based around this idea of collective identity, of group obligations and group debts. Under all of those ideologies are those measuring calipers of the Brazilian doctors, right? There's no way that you can pretend that you're doing this without that being the end point. It's exactly the same logic, exactly the same justification. In fact, we've done it in Europe as well. It was a widespread phenomenon before the war in fascist Europe to have, if you like, affirmative action quotas. It was called numerus clausus, a number of reserved places at university. And the arguments were really very, very similar to what we hear today. The argument was we need to make space for the underrepresented population. The underrepresented population, as I'm sure you've all guessed by now, being non-Jews. In other words, quotas were set, caps were set for the number of Jews in practice who would be allowed to go to university. It was one of the first things that the Nazis did in 1933, this closure of university spaces to non-Aryans, as the law defined them, right? And the argument that the Nazis used, again, sounds eerily familiar. They said, well, we've limited the number of space for Jews to 1.6%, but actually, according to the last census, they're only 0.6% of the population, so what are they complaining about? And that was basically the response of the education minister. Of course, 0.6% of the population, not of the urban or educated population, which of course brings you back to the basic problem, right? That the only way of doing admissions based on individualism rather than collectivism is to say, well, it's up to you to get in, right? It's not a question of which group you're in, it's a question of who passed the exam. And that should be so obvious. It shouldn't need saying, and yet it's about the most controversial thing you can say in a majority of universities throughout the West. The ideology that underpins, the philosophy that underpins all of this group politics, all of this resentment and all of this envy is called by its practitioners postmodernism. Postmodernism roughly meaning that there's no such thing as objective truth. Truth is a product of power structures, and we should all have our own take on it depending on where we are in the hierarchy. But postmodernism is a very bad name for the phenomenon in question. We should really call it pre-modernism. We should call it what it is, a reversion to the pre-Enlightenment idea that elevates the tribe over the individual. And that's why saying harumph, harumph, political correctness gone mad is not an adequate response. We need to understand the magnitude of the threat, that this is an ideology that would sweep away the elevation of the individual on which all of the wealth and progress of the last 2 centuries rests. And the reason that it has traction is precisely because it, unlike modern liberalism, is able to appeal to the inner caveman. It is able to call forth a reaction based on collective identity. So let me finish with an appeal to, particularly to those of you here who are students at Portsmouth or at Southampton. In all of your conversations, not just in your politics, always remember that we are each answerable for our own behavior. This is the basis of every monotheistic religion. It's the basis of all modern freedom. And as soon as you lose sight of that, as soon as you start talking about, well, we shouldn't have done this, meaning a bunch of people who are no longer alive, you deny the whole basis of modern morality and the entire edifice on which the notion of free will rests. It's your duty as heirs to this sublime inheritance to keep intact the ideas that have given us this fantastic world and to pass them on securely to the people who come after you. So I think we've got a little bit of time for quite a bit of time for questions. So I think it's probably easiest, Jack, if I just stand here and take them. But if people want to come, how do you want to do this? There's a mic here. Do you want to pass that around?
Hi, Nan.
Hi.
I'm interested in, I've got 2 questions. Firstly, I want to take your take on the budget that was announced yesterday and whether it is a move to Keynesian economics. And secondly, your position on protectionism against China, because there's a lot of free traders as well in America which are pro-free trade with the rest of the world, however, with China especially, want protectionism because they're not playing by WTO rules.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Those are both really good questions. And let me deal with them in order. Where have all the fiscal conservatives gone on either side of the Atlantic? Where are they? When Obama was spending more than he was receiving, there were Tea Party protesters in all 50 states. Now, the deficit is $1 trillion a year. Where are all those guys? Where's the Tea Party when you need it? Right? And it's a similar thing in Britain. There was less of an active campaign, but nonetheless, the consensus that we needed to live within our means has suddenly vanished on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the reason that is given for this is, well, interest rates are so low, it'd be positively rude not to borrow. And I kind of get the argument. Sajid Javid used to argue this all the time. Interest rates are now so low that we have this quite extraordinary, I think unprecedented situation where there is a negative yield for government borrowing, right? So say interest on government debt might be 0.5%. If inflation is 1.5%, then incredibly the creditor is actually paying the government for the privilege of lending to it, right? So in that situation, the argument goes, we need to borrow, now's the time to be building bridges and airports. Okay, I kind of get that, but it assumes that the interest rates are never going to move. If that gamble turns out to be wrong, if interest rates return to a historically more normal level, and we've taken on all this extra debt in the meantime, it's going to be unsustainable. Unsustainable economically, and by the way, unsustainable morally, right? It is outrageous that we are expecting other generations to pick up the tab for what we're doing. Right? In our own lives, we all accept that that is bad behavior. We would all condemn someone who ran up huge bills and passed them on to his kids. Right? The morality doesn't change when you are behaving as voters and taxpayers rather than as parents or grandparents. So I would just, on the issue of debt, whether it's, yes, of course, coronavirus, special case and all the rest of it, but I have to ask the question, if at the end of a decade of growth, if at a time of full employment, of years of full employment, a time when more people are in work than ever before in British history, if we are not paying back debt now, then when are we ever going to pay it back? If you're not prepared to try and restore order and sanity to your fiscal policy at a time like this, then it's far from being, Keynes would have said, the last 5 years is when you should have been getting back into balance. So it is simply then giving up on any pretense of living within our means. And eventually a government that does that will end up defaulting. That's law of gravity. The question of China is a very interesting one. And I think that two things are conflated here. One is the question of trade with China. Should there be tariffs? Should there be non-tariff barriers? What should be China's relationship with the WTO? The other is the question of, if you like, Chinese bad behavior in terms of theft of intellectual property or espionage or whatever. But they are separate questions, right? That Chinese bad behavior will happen whether or not you have a free trade agreement with China. The US has no FTA with China and it's still complaining about those things, right? So one is a question of policing, invigilation, control. The other is a question of what should be your policy in terms of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Of course, you need to police the system. You need to enforce property rights, including intellectual property rights. I think that is uncontroversial. I can't imagine anyone in this room would disagree with that, and I can't imagine anyone on either side of the aisle in the United States would disagree with that. But that has spilled over into a separate argument that says China's trade is unfair. They're manipulating their exchange rate. They're dumping cheap steel on us. They're subsidizing industries indirectly by giving them cheaper energy or whatever. I don't buy that there is such a thing as a manipulated exchange rate, right? Even if you did, actually, it's currently very difficult to see how you could make that argument about China. But let's, for the sake of argument, suppose that China really is producing steel at below production cost. Right? In other words, that the Chinese taxpayer is subsidizing the manufacture of artificially cheap steel that is then sold abroad in a way that is cheaper than all of the rivals. Right. If that's true, if that's what's happening, the correct attitude should be, great, thank you. We'll have as much as you want to give us. Every ton of that steel is a gift from the Chinese taxpayer to the American consumer. If they really are foolish enough to want to behave that way, then we'll take everything that you're buying. Now, is that bad news for the US steel sector? Yes, it is. But the difficulty for the US steel sector is many times outweighed, many times over, by the benefits to everybody else. There are something like 120,000 people working in steel production in the US. There are something like 7 million working in industries that use steel. Car manufacturing, aeronautics, construction, right? If they are able to benefit from much cheaper steel, which is what we're talking about here with the tariffs, then suddenly they get a huge boost to their efficiency without having to lift a finger. They can produce stuff more cheaply. They can employ more people. Costs fall. So everyone suddenly has more money. Everyone, if you like, is able to work the same hours as before but keep extra disposable income because of the artificially low price given to them courtesy of the Chinese taxpayer. And what are they going to do with that extra income? They're going to spend it on other things, right? Thereby giving a massive lift to the entire economy that will hugely outweigh the specific cost to the US steel sector. The countries that have done this have, without exception, become rich. The countries that have said, we will allow imports in without fussing about reciprocity, we will cut our tariffs regardless of what the other guy does, are the countries, without exception, that have become the richest. I gave the example of Singapore earlier. Singapore, that has to import its food, its drinking water, its electricity, has become one of the richest places on the planet. It's gone from being half of our GDP per head in the 50s to twice our GDP per head now. They've gone from being half as rich as us to twice as rich as us. On the basis of what? Zero resources. Zero agriculture, very little industry, but a willingness to trade without putting artificial impediments in the path of commerce. And every country that does that ends up being richer.
Does anyone else have a question? Please go up. Sorry, I'm going to ask you to stand here just so you don't block the camera. Yes. If you're speaking to the mic.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. I was going to ask, you mentioned about moving from status to contract and how we're no longer at the whims of... Sorry. Can you hear me now? Or
I'll repeat the question. Go on.
you talked about moving from status to contract. We're no longer at the whims of despots and awful kings.
Great, isn't it?
Yeah, it is great. I was just wondering, is there any time you would see that maybe state intervention is a strong word, that maybe a contract from an individual, maybe too onerous on a populace, where there would need to be an intervention from somebody with powers? It's a question of a division of power. The example that comes to my mind is non-compete clauses. Often used in industry so that you don't steal intellectual ideas from one company when you move to another, which seems fair enough, but there's a growing, what can be seen as a growing problem where it's happening in more low-skilled sectors where somebody may be working at Burger King and then they might want to get a higher-paying job with the same skills at, say, McDonald's, but Burger King may put a non-compete clause in the contract, so
Sure.
they can't move for 6 months or a year or however long it is, so they lose that freedom. So how would you argue that balance of freedom and power?
Did everyone hear the question? So are there any circumstances where contract isn't enough, where somebody needs to step in because the contract can be loaded, and the example given was a non-compete clause where you're prevented from taking another job because of the contract you signed with the previous one? So look, there is no law out there and there is no economic system out there that can make people cleverer. So in any population, half of the population will be of below average intelligence, some of them significantly, and some of them are going to make bad decisions. So the claim made by defenders of the market model is not that everyone is going to be rich all the time, it's that it is on balance a better system than any of the alternatives. Okay? So of course there are still going to be individual flaws in any system, but I think you can argue both in theory and in practice empirically this has been one that has been better at delivering happiness and freedom than any of the others. And you have to... I'm arguing that a contract is a good, solid way of organizing an economy. That if you and I sign a deal, that in general there has to be a really, really good reason for somebody else to come between us and declare our contract illegal, right? And if you don't want to give me a special clause on paternity leave or something, it's in my book not a good enough reason. If I'm happy to work for you, you're happy to employ me, we're both happy with the terms, then it is wrong for a government to come between us and say, oh, but the minimum wage or whatever, right? That's my basic starting point. Will you get occasional exploitation and people making bad decisions and so on? Yeah, of course. And so there will need to be some limitations. For example, I would give the case of if the contract contains small print that nobody could have reasonably been expected to have understood. Or there was an example that was inertia selling. People would sort of, up until the early 70s, they would stick an encyclopedia through someone's letterbox and say, unless it's given back, you're going to be billed. Now that seems to me, okay, even if the contract technically says that, it seems to me a reasonable case where the government can come in and say, that is not a fair contract, right? But in general, there is no better system. And I would say this, it's a very moral way of behaving. It's a very moral relationship to have with another person. People sometimes say, okay, let's concede that the market system is efficient. But isn't there more to life? What about obligations we have as friends or family members? Yeah, great. In about 3/4 of an hour or an hour, my local cab firm from my village on the other side of Hampshire will come. And he'll be here on time, and I'll pay him on time. My contractual relationship with the guy who owns that taxi company is a perfectly moral one. I do everything he expects me to do. He does everything I expect him to do. Could I tell you that my relations with my friends, my wife, my children are always that perfect? No. No one can, right? Don't ever diss the wonder of a system that allows people to know exactly what they're expecting from the other party. It is both an ethical and an efficient way of organizing things. And I'll say one other thing, if I can digress very slightly. A very frequent criticism of the market system is that, okay, even if it is a rational way to optimize resources, it's heartless, it's cold, it's materialistic, it's soulless, it lacks the warm humanity that we would like an alternative system supposedly to have. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I was, as Jack said, 21 years in politics. I was president of my university Conservative Association. I've spent most of my adult life with people who believe in free markets and free enterprise. I don't think I've ever met a single person who believes that you have more pleasure in a big bank account than in going for a nice walk in the country, or listening to Beethoven, or playing with your kids. Right? But what is it that enables us to do all of those things? It's economic growth. It's this thing that in our snotty first world way we're now sneering about. Right? It's because you can now afford a dishwasher and you don't have to do everything by hand that you can go for that walk in the country. It's because you can drive to work and you don't have to change buses 3 or 4 times and walk that you have time to go and listen to the Beethoven. It's because you don't have to spend 7 days a week working flat out just to feed your kids that you can take the weekend off and play with them, right? It is an immensely spoiled argument to say none of that really matters. We've somehow and yet every generation does it. Again, why? Because the inner caveman is struggling, howling with anguish, trying to understand the prosperity of the world around him. One last point. No system can make people compassionate. And when people talk about we will have a more compassionate interventionist way. Only a human being can be compassionate, right? A set of laws can't. And the compassion, the selfishness or the altruism of that person will not be determined, primarily by the economic system under which he lives. Except insofar as people who live under coercive and tyrannical systems tend to see their circles of reciprocity narrow, their social capital drained. They become more watchful, less trusting, and more difficult people over time because they've had to effectively function as serfs under a despotism. Would you rather be poor in South Korea or in North Korea? Would you rather have been a kind of grungy, protesting, anti-systemic young person in West Berlin or in East Berlin? We are dealing with necessarily imperfect systems because we are a flawed and fallen species. But dealing in a world of imperfections, I have no hesitation in saying that we've hit on so far by far the least imperfect system available.
Thank you. Yeah, if you'd like to come up, sir. Then we'll go for you, and then you at the back. I can hold it if that's okay.
Right, so this is not a sound reinforcement mic, so I'll try to be loud. I just want to go back to the point about elevating the individual above the collective. So yes, capitalism is better than socialism. Just wanted to ask, how far do you envisage we'll take this idea? Because if we take it to the logical extremes, we're not going to have such a thing as a national self-interest. We're not going to have the Anglosphere. We're not going to have Great Britain. It's all going to be like an anarchist wall with private armies. Mm-hmm. So do you envisage a stopgap somewhere, and how are you going to design that?
Yes, a very fair question. And you won't be surprised that, yes, I think there is a limit, right? So you could argue that Somalia is a country without any functioning state, but I think few of us would want to live in Somalia. What I'm in favor of is not anarchy, but minimal government. I think most of us will accept that there are situations where you need to have some state intervention in order to create a sphere where freedom is protected. I mean, the most obvious example being the provision of an impartial legal system. The rule of law, I think, was the thing that most distinguished first the Anglosphere, then Europe, and now the free world from countries where the rulers can make up the rules as they go along. You gave the example of defense, and who can argue, right? It would be, even by quite extreme libertarian arguments, I think it would be very difficult to make the case that we can all rely on private armies. If you're trying to defend a national territory, you need to have some subscription to a force that will defend it. I think most of us can see that. There are externalities, pollution, whatever. Somebody needs to assess and mediate the disputes that arise from them. And when you have, as now, an epidemiological crisis, again, it's very difficult to say, well, just let everyone completely do their own thing, because again, there are externalities. If I knew that I was carrying some terrible plague and I'd come here and infected you, that would not just be a question of my freedom. There are wider preoccupations. I've been struck over the last week on that last point by how many articles I've read. There was one in the New York Times today saying, we're all socialists now, talking about the coronavirus response. And my friend Ben Shapiro came out with a very nice response. He said, here is another article that says, here is a coronavirus being likened to a thing that isn't coronavirus, so we're all socialists, right? I'm not aware of any free market, small government people who say that there shouldn't be, in a case like this, some government action. There are economies of scale where there needs to be government. What I'm saying is that our presumption should be to minimize it. That other things being equal, you should always have to make the case as to why to intervene rather than why not to. And I think we are a long way away from that presumption in almost any part of the world, including in this country. When you hear politicians describing a tax cut as a giveaway, when you hear even conservatives saying, well, you know, you shouldn't bribe people with a tax cut, then they have badly got it the wrong way around. There is absolutely no world in which taking less from somebody can be described as a bribe or a giveaway to them. right? And that's my problem, that we're instead of seeing state intervention as a disagreeable and occasional necessity, we've come to see it almost as a first resort. We legislate as a kind of virtue signaling. And that's a very bad place to be for any society that wants to elevate freedom. Yeah. Yeah.
Just get my question up. So thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed that. But one thing I'm really concerned about in the UK that I feel is not really being talked about is the demographic change that is occurring within the UK. So according to the Professor of Demography at the University of Oxford, David Coleman, Indigenous white Brits are expected to become a minority in their own country by 2066, especially with Theresa May secretly signing the UN Global Compact for Migration in late 2018, which calls for the replacement migration of untold millions of economic migrants who cannot integrate into British culture. Unlike the state of Israel for the Jewish people, there is no safe haven white people can go to once they're a minority within the UK. We can use London as a case study for how the country will become from this, as London has now become a minority white British population of just 45%. Islamic grooming gangs are now running rampant across the UK. For example, 1,400 almost exclusively white girls in Rotherham, some as young as 8, were groomed and gang raped by predominantly Pakistani grooming gangs from 1997 to 2013, and the council and the police refused to investigate these in fear of being called a racist. Furthermore, there are huge discrepancies and overrepresentations within crime statistics within ethnic minority groups in the country, and this is a result of intentional mass immigration, which was no accident, mainly as a result of Tony Blair's government, who was in an alleged Mossad agent, paedophile and blackmailer Jeffrey Epstein's now notorious Black Book. So my questions to you are, do you accept, yes or no, that there is an intentional white demographic replacement taking place within the UK? And if so, do you think Britain will become more or less like Britain the less ethnically white this country gets?
No.
But do you not feel that all this stuff is intentional? Do you not feel that all this?
I mean, so you asked me, do yes or no? So I tried. So I tried to answer in
No,
one.
I understand. Thank you for answering it.
I mean, I think there's a number of assumptions that you made there with which I disagree. First being that immigrants are incapable of assimilating. And I don't think that is a fear that every society has, but that actually very rarely turns out to be true. I mean, obviously, you know, if you're looking at the Anglo-Saxon invasion or something, but in a modern organized society, I mean, Boris Johnson is descended from immigrants. I don't think anyone would say that his family has failed to integrate, right? He's descended, you know, I was born in another country. You know, maybe I don't fit in here, but I feel pretty patriotic about the place, right? So, I mean, I don't think that I don't think it is impossible. And particularly in our country, I think Britain has always had a civil rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. If you look back at the army that won the Great War on our behalf, it looked, I would say, a lot more like the Britain of 2018 than like the Britain of 1918. It was full, in other words, of young men who had been prepared to cross half the world in order to fight for a country which in many cases they'd never set eyes on because they believed in its values. And there's a reason why people want to come here. People don't think of what's involved in each individual migratory story. You're leaving behind friends and family, language, familiarity. You don't go through all of that to go to a country that you think's a bit crap, right? I mean, you're making a great vote of confidence in the country that you're choosing to come to. So I don't accept that assimilation is impossible, and I don't accept that nationality is defined by physiognomy. I mean, I think Britain is capable. There are plenty of people who are capable of becoming patriotic and useful British citizens despite their grandparents having been born somewhere else. Where I do think there is a problem is in the barriers thrown up by multiculti liberals in this country that make assimilation more difficult. So as I said, having come here from somewhere else, generally you've done so in a positive frame of mind, right? You want to make a success of your life. This is the usual story of most migrants in most places. But then if you land in a country whose sense of patriotism has been systematically derided and traduced by its own intellectual elites, it is much harder to find something that you want to integrate into. Take the examples of some of the things you were talking about: religious extremism, British-born kids, who have ended up in militias in Iraq or Syria or whatever. Right? The people who have been so alienated by the nationality of the country that they were born in that they've been prepared to take up arms against it or become terrorists. Right? I wonder whether we should look at the life stories of some of those kids and look at what experiences they had. If they got any history at all in school, if they got any British history at all, it would have been presented to them as a hateful chronicle of racism and exploitation. Most of their interactions with the British state will have taught them to despise it. All of the ideology, especially at local level, will have been, if you like, that Britishness is a shameful brand. If that's and in fact, by the way, that may be linked to the way in which a number of English and Scottish and Welsh voters are groping back towards, if you like, older identities that don't have this image problem. But where does that leave you if your parents came from, I don't know, Bangladesh or Iraq or whatever, right? Some people in that category, if they don't have a patriotic British brand that they want to buy into, in the way that those young men had in 1918, are going to start casting around for an alternative identity that feels stronger. Yeah, go on.
Do you not feel with someone like Ash Sarkar, who repeatedly gets a BBC Question Time platform, a notorious anti-white hater? She recently came out in a video celebrating the fact that 600,000 Indigenous white people had left London, and she quoted the fact saying, "Yes, lads, we're winning." So this is someone who is not indigenously British, and she came on and she's actively celebrating a movement away from white people from London, the indigenous East Enders of London. And I can't remember his name, but there was an English gentleman who recently said to one of his friends, I think it was a couple of years ago, he said that London is no longer an English city. And I just wanted to get your opinion on whether you thought it's a good thing that London is no longer represented by English people, in the sense that you've now got mass crime going through London. I think it was in 2018, I think it was 1 minute into the new year, you had someone stabbed to death in London. You had all aspects of violent crime in London increased drastically under Sadiq Khan. And we now have in the polls in London, I think Sadiq Khan is now polling at something like 60 to 70%. So this is my point, in the sense that I believe that demographics are destiny. It doesn't matter how many conferences we hold, it doesn't matter how much we try to change people's ideologies, people will always seem to stick to their roots in essence. And I feel that, in a sense, we're not really going to get anywhere with continuously pushing free market ideology and continuously pushing these things. In essence, people will always stick to their own kind. And someone like Ash Sarkar, we say that why is it that this person is constantly bolstered up in Question Time? And why is it that in the UK state media, and why is it that within the UK state education, why is constantly anti-British narratives constantly perpetuated? And it's all well and good saying things like, what is going on, and things like this are anti-British, but you have to ask the question is, why are these things anti-British in Britain? And mass immigration was no accident. I think Britain was doing perfectly fine as an isolationist country in the 60s and the 70s, and there were no real problems in crime. People could leave their doors unlocked in the street, children would play with each other, and now it seems in the UK people can't even look each other in the eye anymore. We see violent crime is increasing day to day. And we see that places like Birmingham, we're seeing, I believe there was a report in Birmingham a couple of years ago, no whites after 4 p.m. So we're seeing that certain ethnic groups are starting to conglomerate with each other and in this country, and they're not seeming to integrate within UK culture. And I want to put forward, I hope not to take too much time for this, but I want to ask you, put forward one hypothetical scenario to you. So say a hypothetical scenario in the 60s or the 70s where the Chinese government were asking for white people in England all over the world, or specifically in the UK, to come over and work because it would be good to increase GDP in China. No, say I went with my hypothetical white wife and 3 white children to China. Would those 3 white children be just as Chinese as every other Chinese person over there? Do you think within China we'd be laughing around the family TV in Mandarin? Do you think we'd have Chinese cultural poster icons all over the walls? Or do you think that there's going to be English segregation within China? And say if it wasn't just my family, say if it was 10, 100,000, 100,000, let's say what it is currently in the UK, which is an average of, I think it's believe around 260,000 average net immigration from 2010 to 2019, with 2010 being about 400,000 net immigrants into the UK. How long do you think it would take before pubs started appearing all across Beijing, for example, and then the ethnic Chinese population was around 45%?
Yeah.
Do you think that English people would start to perpetuate Chinese culture, or do you think it would become more English, and do you think the English would start to take over?
So there's first of all, I want to make a specific point about your Ash Sarkar point. Obviously, you know, it irritates me that our state media promote people only because they have fashionable views, and her views are not mine. But I want to say something really important. I don't know if you actually saw the clip that you were quoting, but it was very obvious that she was making a joke. And I've had enough of lefties pretending not to see jokes and fainting like affronted Victorian matrons, you know, exposing their underskirts because someone has obviously made a joke, is usually Boris, and everyone pretends that they don't see that it's a joke, right? So we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we shouldn't respond in kind. If somebody makes a clumsy joke, there's no point in taking it out of context and pretending to be outraged. So we can't have this both ways. We can't condemn it from the other side and then do it ourselves.
So just quickly to fire back on that one, sorry to interrupt, but I feel like with someone like Ash Sarkar, she'll never be punished for something like this. She will continually get.
Well, nor should she be. It's free. I mean, no, she shouldn't be punished for saying things. You have every right to not watch her, and fine. But I'm strongly against the idea that anyone should be, as you put it, punished. I'm strongly against anyone being ostracized for anything that they say.
But I mean, she won't lose her platform, and she's in no fear of...
Right, and neither should anyone else. So let's at least agree that if we don't want people... everyone has the right to withdraw an audience. Everyone has the right to say, I don't want to listen to you. But that is not the same thing as silencing people. I just want to... I want to open this up to other people, but I just want to come back on your main point about the capacity of a country to absorb migration while maintaining its essential character. Of course, it is true on some level that every new arrival brings something. Of course, that's right. Ronald Reagan used to say, "Every immigrant makes America more American." So yes, you will see some changes in the gestalt of a country, we might call it, the texture of the country. There'll be different cuisine. There'll be, but sticking with America for a second, every generation of Americans, without exception, going right back to the Republic, has had the same attitude to immigration, which is, yeah, it's all been great up until now, but this time it's different. It's all been fine and but just wait until and there's always been some new factor. Yeah, but up until now they were all from the British Isles. Well, yeah, but up until now they were all Protestants. Oh, yeah, but up until now they were all white. And yet it carries on being a pretty darn successful country. And the reason it does is because it is able to have an expansive and assertive sense of nationality that allows newcomers to want to belong to something. And the expressions of American patriotism that make the Euro snobs shudder, the bunting and the flags and the songs, are precisely what makes it easy for newcomers and their kids to feel that they belong. And if we are serious about maintaining the character, the free and rule-based character of this country and all of the things that we admire, we should be more proud and patriotic about celebrating them so that every child in a British school, wherever their grandparents were from, feels a sense of the wonder and privilege of being part of this extraordinary polity.
Can I just please tell you this one?
I think we've got to take a couple more. I'm sorry, I've given you plenty of time, but if you don't mind, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'll keep this short and sweet. What are your views on the HS2 rail link between Manchester and London?
I'll keep this short and sweet. I'm against it.
I know you have an honourable contract with your taxi driver, which is probably...
That's all right. That's all right.
But,
We've got another. We've got
here
it.
in Portsmouth. Two quick questions from me. First of all, you and I have walked the streets together, we've knocked on doors together, and we've campaigned for Britain, a sovereign Britain outside of the European Union, and here we are, hopefully, eventually by the end of this year. But the last Parliament did everything it could to tie the hands of Britain in that negotiation. So my first question is, how do you see a much more liberal Prime Minister than we've had in the previous two Conservative Prime Ministers negotiating this deal? And I know that both you and I advocated the European Economic Area. I think that's looking like it's slipping away, but I'd be really interested to get your take on that. And the second question linked to it, whilst there are many downfalls with the European Union, what do you think the positives are that Britain will take away from having been a member for 40 years?
Those are all very good questions, Anna. Thank you. The EFTA option has gone, sadly. I mean, it would have been a very quick, easy way out. It would have spared us a lot of the anguish of the last 3 years. We could have taken that and built on it. But frankly, it was shot down by both sides, and it has now become pointless. The main argument for doing it, which was that this was going to ease our way out, no longer applies. So that moment was lost. As far as the Prime Minister goes and his approach to the talks, I mean, let me just say in general, I've known this Prime Minister for a while. He and I were on the Telegraph together nearly 30 years ago. I mean, as soon as someone becomes Prime Minister, everyone starts claiming to know them much better than they really do. But I have known him for longer than most people, and we text each other regularly. He spoke at every one of every campaign for the European Parliament that I launched from 1998 onwards. He was the guy who spoke for me, and so I feel at least that I know him well enough to say this with confidence. He is the brightest person I've ever worked with. And I don't mean in the sense that he quotes Greek odes and composes them on the spot, and I mean he eccentrically does, but I mean that he's sharp. I mean that 2 words into your sentence, he knows where you're going. He remembers everyone. He's shrewd. He's a brilliant delegator. And when I look at who he's surrounded himself with, in terms of ministers, in terms of number 10 staff, in terms of special advisors, they are the highest caliber people I can remember in all the time I've been observing politics in those positions. So I have every confidence in his handling of the Brexit talks, and he wants, I hope, what most of us want, which is to get back sovereignty and then have the friendliest and closest relationship with our European allies compatible with being a completely self-governing country. And I don't think that is an impossible goal. I think it's a perfectly modest and reasonable thing, and I'm confident that he'll secure it. In terms of a good question, is there anything that we should take with us? What will I miss from Brussels? Well, actually, I'll miss quite a few things from Brussels. I've taught myself not to use Brussels as a shorthand for all the things that I don't like about the EU. The good people of that handsome Flemish city never asked to have the monstrosity built in the middle of their town, and it's as alienating for a lot of them as it is for us. So I will miss lots and lots of things about Brussels. My girls grew up there. It's haunted by happy ghosts, and I hope to go back and see friends there regularly. I will not miss the EU institutions. We were never a good fit there. I think we felt the tug of language and law pulling us towards more distant horizons in a way that the other countries never really understood. And I think that we will be happier, we and they, if instead of this constant carping and pettiness, arguing about every agricultural price-fixing round and the location of every EU institution, if we become a friendly neighbour rather than a grudging province. The one thing that I hope we can keep, I mean, the one, let me rephrase your question very slightly. You know, was there anything about the EU that I thought was a good thing that was better than just having? I'll tell you what was a good thing. It was a good thing to have countries talking to each other regularly. Right? It was a good thing that on any typical Tuesday, you would have in Brussels 28 agriculture ministers, transport ministers, interior ministers, whatever it was. And that was such a normal event, such a commonplace activity that it didn't even merit a press release. So that it's good to have the coordination. Trouble was, you didn't need all the rest of it just to have the coordination. You didn't need to have, you know, the common policies on tax and fisheries and farming and employment law and environmental protection and the common flag and anthem and all the rest of it. If the EU had simply been an association of states collectively working to achieve what they couldn't achieve singly, we'd have never had a referendum. We'd have never had an argument. We'd have all been in favor of that. So the question is, how do we now, you know, how do we maximize the opportunities that have opened up in front of us or are opening in front of us over the next 12 months? I actually think we are likely to have a pretty good deal with the EU. I think despite everything we're hearing about the distance between the two parties, always remember, you know, a lot of the coverage on the BBC particularly seems to operate on the assumption that trade is an act of kindness. You know, that countries trade with each other out of generosity. You know, so you hear, you know, Katja Adler and people saying we shouldn't expect any favors from the EU. Well, I'm not aware that anyone's expecting any favors from the EU. What we're expecting is that the EU will behave in its self-interest. And on the 31st of January, we became its single biggest export destination. So the idea that with everything going on at the moment, that the EU will go out of its way to place barriers in its own path, I think is unlikely. I mean, if they do, we'll get on with it, but I think it is highly unlikely. So I expect us to have a deal with the EU that at the very least maintains the 0 for 0 tariff arrangements and a number of the practical arrangements we have on aviation, road transport, and so on. And I think it may indeed go a great deal further on services. Given what's happening in Italy, the need for access to the world's best and cheapest money markets in London has suddenly become a bigger deal than it was 2 weeks ago. In terms of what we're doing elsewhere, I think the world is our oyster. I think we will have, there's a real prospect that we will have, maybe not ratified, but at least negotiated and signed a deal with the United States before the November election there. I think that there is a real ambition in DC to get that done. I'm sure we will have almost immediately trade agreements in place with Australia and New Zealand, probably also with Singapore. Those are the most open economies. They are common law, English-speaking countries. They share our regulatory model. They have interoperable economies. And I actually am pretty ambitious that about getting a deal, and pretty optimistic about getting a deal with Japan within the next year or 18 months, which is, we inherit one through the EU, but actually it's a bit rubbish. The EU-Japan deal, from our point of view, doesn't really cover the things we're interested in. It's very heavily weighted towards agriculture and some continental heavy industries. It doesn't do what we want, which is financial services, investor protection, data flows, and so on. So I think all of that will happen. And by the way, once we've got Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, I think there is an overwhelming argument for Britain joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP as it's now called. Some of you may think that that is in defiance of geography. And it is certainly true that we are not technically a Pacific country, except in the sense that we do own the Pitcairn Islands. So we're actually slap bang in the middle of the Pacific. And those 64 descendants of bounty mutineers do in fact give us a foothold in the Pacific. But of course, if you look at the Anglosphere countries around the Pacific Rim, US, Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and so on, it is an obvious place for us to be expanding. So I think that within a couple of years, we will have probably 80-90% of our, or at least 80% of our trade covered by deep and ambitious FTAs. And at that stage, we're going to wonder what all the fuss was about and why we didn't leave the EU a lot earlier than we did.
Hurrah.
Hello. Yeah, my name's Tim Edwards. I lived in Luxembourg for several years, which, as you know, is a seething pit of EU institutions. And consequently, I decided to leave, I think, on June the 25th, 2016. I was just saying, I lived in Luxembourg for a long time, 15 years, and then left, or decided to leave, on the 26th of June, 2016, having, after the referendum, having suffered some pretty vitriolic and nasty comeback from my colleagues at work. I didn't even have the vote. I'd been non-resident for so long, I didn't even have the vote. Anyway, given that so my question is, given that the EU Parliament recently, when they gave Barnier his mandate, voted massively, I don't know what the vote was, 95% in favour of this mandate, and they're just a million miles away from what we want, a million miles away from the way we're approaching it. How much influence, or how much realistically power does the EU Parliament have to either ratify the agreement, ratify the deal, or actually they're just going to be told, put up and shut up? Because
yeah, I mean,
Guy Verhofstadt is clearly a very dangerous man.
Yeah, the European Parliament generally does not have very much power in these situations because remember that all the MEPs answer to their party leaders, and their party leaders would have done whatever the deal is. So it's very rare that they defy their own parties, not least because they can be dropped from the list like that, and it's a very lucrative position to be dropped from, as I can tell you. So they tend to do what they're told. But, I mean, you're right, the EU is at the moment making some absurd and unreasonable demands. And to demonstrate that, imagine it the other way around. Imagine that the United Kingdom were to go into these talks saying, well, we're happy to have a free trade agreement with you, but only on the basis that we have unlimited access to your fishing grounds, that British judges continue to have a role in what happens on the continent, and that, and let's reopen the question of France's illegal occupation of Calais. I mean, that would be, I think, regarded by commentators on both sides of the channel as a preposterous position. I don't think you would find any British journalists cheering that on, apart from maybe Little John. And yet, such has been the culture war here, and the nastiness and the polarization that followed Brexit, that a very large minority of the British population has got itself into a place where they will automatically applaud any EU demand, however self-contradictory, however unwise. Right. And that I think is a terrible pity, and that of course has encouraged the EU to be more intransigent because they're getting a certain press for it here which makes them think, it's not being... But having said all of that, when the deadline is looming, the idea that the European Union is going to I mean, think about it like this. No deal, if there's no agreement, that's much closer to Britain's negotiating aims than to the EU's, right? A failure of the talks, from our point of view, yes, it creates friction with our biggest market, but it means that immediately from day one, we can change all of our laws and regulations to become more competitive. From the EU's point of view, there is friction with their biggest market and no upside whatever. Everything else carries on as now. And for that reason, I think it is overwhelmingly likely that there will be a deal this year.
They're more they're not sort of rule of law, they're more law of rules.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I think that in the Barnier mandate that you referred to, we are still seeing a certain peevishness 3 years after the vote, right? If Barnier were being honest, he would say, do you know what, we're still annoyed, we're still affronted, we're still cross with you for having voted leave, and we want to lash out in some way, and even if we can't hurt you without hurting ourselves, we still can't bear the thought of it succeeding. Now, that is a mood. That's not really a rational policy that survives a negotiation.
Right. That's what I think that's what you're right.
We'll see.
I think you're right.
We'll see. We'll see.
Large minority.
We'll see. Look, I mean, I'm not any kind of oracle. I didn't see coronavirus coming, right? I could be wrong, but that seems to me the more likely outcome.
Yeah, absolutely in agreement.
Well, so this is going to be our last question from George here, just because of time.
Hi, George.
Or would you like? Oh, yeah. Sorry, one more after George.
Yep.
First of all, idea of retaking Calais, great idea. Second of all, you mentioned about universities and how they're not teaching us to think about the hard questions, which, as someone who's gone to university, I've found to be completely true. The only question I ask is that you suggested combating that in some way, but how are people who perhaps don't conform to the narrative supposed to do that when we're not given a platform to do so?
Yeah.
We're pretty much shut down the second we even suggest we might be thinking differently.
I know.
And when we're up against what's essentially become more or less a religious cult, in that it's such a accepted thing on campus that it's almost like Christianity a couple hundred years ago in Europe, where everyone knows it to be true, and to step away from it is like kind of fun.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think certain values have been sacralized. They are treated as religious truths, in the sense that when somebody dissents, the expected response to the dissent is anger and rejection rather than reason and engagement. I suppose you could argue that this is not new. I mean, if you go back a couple of hundred years, universities, while thinking of themselves as centers of reason and logic and the Enlightenment, managed in many cases to maintain a religious test, to keep you out if you didn't sign up to whatever the religion of that country was. And they pulled this double think off. Some of them felt uncomfortable about it, but others went ahead with it. And I think they're doing something very similar now. But of course, the religion is the identity politics. It's the grievance politics, the wokeness, and all the rest of it, rather than actual religion. But if you look at the way in which student protesters work themselves up before a heretical speaker arrives on campus, I think any anthropologist would see it as a religious thing. The chanting, the shared rituals, what Durkheim would call the communal frenzy, right? It's not about I disagree with your position on immigration, or I disagree with your position on multiculturalism. It is about you are an evil, diabolical presence, and for the sake of our collective purity, we need to get rid of you. Now, of course, this is not a completely new phenomenon, right? People at that age can be remarkably intolerant, and that's always true. What I think is new and very sudden has been the combination of that zealotry with this very ugly and unattractive self-pity. So I'll tell you, when I first noticed this, I was at Oriel College, Oxford, which is where the statue of Cecil Rhodes is. Okay, so the overture of this whole thing in Britain was the Rhodes Must Fall movement some 5 or 6 years ago. I say a statue of Cecil Rhodes. I mean, it's a little guano-encrusted mannequin about this high in a niche so high up that you have to really twist your head to see the thing that you're determined to be offended by. But what was fascinating, I could imagine a group of lefty students in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s saying, tear down the evil colonialist. What was new, and what I think would not have happened until this generation, was the internalization of the complaint. I feel violated every time I have to walk past it. I feel unsafe on a campus where this is. That is absolutely new. And it's what, there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is about this, what they call this fragility. And they make the point that if you look at the vocabulary that we associate with it, safe spaces, trigger warnings, cultural appropriations, microaggressions, none of these phrases existed before 2015. Right? We've gone very, very suddenly, we've lurched into this position of constant grievance, constant woundedness. And Lukyanov makes the argument, I think, incredibly convincingly, that quite apart from being bad for everybody else, because none of us wants to be in a situation where people are waiting to pounce on any loose word in order to be angry, it's very bad for the people who are encouraged to take offense, because it's almost... Lukyanov is a great believer in what he called in cognitive behavioral therapy, a way that you treat some psychological problems by taking control of the situation assertively. And he says, if you were doing the opposite, if you could do a sort of anti-CBT, it would be this woke ideology that encourages everyone to see everything as directed at them. And he argues, I think fairly convincingly, that the rise in mental health problems on campus correlates pretty exactly to this new way of looking at the world. I think it's not even only on campus. You know, I have a child who's going to start school in September, so I've been looking at schools. And in almost every one, there is a prominently displayed notice on the board that says bullying policy or anti-bullying policy, anti-presumably. And almost always they say the same thing, which is, you know, bullying is any kind of behavior or action that causes offense to someone. Really? Really? And what if eating a cheese sandwich causes offense to someone? Right? And the mistake we're making, the fateful mistake we're making, is we are encouraging people to lose the sense of volition, of agency, right? I think all of you would understand intuitively the difference between me bumping into you by mistake and you falling over, and me pushing you. Even if the effect were the same, it's a hugely different circumstance, right? But if you're encouraged, from the moment you go to school age 4, to see anything you don't like as a kind of violence against you, how do we expect you to react the first time you are confronted with opinions that you really find difficult as an undergraduate? You know, and I think this is an incredibly dangerous thing for the kids themselves. In my former university, I saw the law students, law undergraduates, were being given trigger warnings before they had to read about disturbing cases. I mean, who would employ a lawyer from that generation, right? And there is going to be a moment, and you hear it already, where employers are saying, oh, if I let anyone of that age in, it's going to be endless litigation, constant complaints, you know, better off without them. And so I think this is, I think you'll have picked up, I'm generally optimistic about the state of the country, about the state of the world. But this deeply corrosive anti-enlightenment ideology on campus is the single biggest worry we have, because it undoes the basis of what keeps our society open and free. Okay, I think there's various things.
Sorry, could you say?
Yeah, how do we come? Sorry,
how do we
You're
combat
reminding me,
that?
so that
Yeah,
was
'cause
part of
that
your
was the
question. Sorry, I got
question,
carried
yes.
away with myself. Okay, here's a few things. First, you can try and diversify the universities. In other words, create new ones, right? I mean, 1960, one school leaver in 50 went on to higher education. 1990, which was the year that I matriculated, it was 1 in 4. Millennium year, 1 in 3, now 1 in 2. That massive expansion of numbers has gone hand in hand with, and has been intimately connected to this lurch to the left among the lecturers. In the 60s, 1 in 3 university teachers self-identified as right of centre. Now it's 1 in 11. And in the humanities, it's functionally 0. Right? So that part of it is addressing the question of, I know this is a difficult thing to do in this country. It's easier in some places. It's harder here. You need a royal charter if you want to be called a university, and it's a complicated project. But since there is this massive expansion of the tertiary education sector, shouldn't conservative-minded people create some more private university? We have effectively one in this kind of one full spectrum one. we could do with a few more. Another thing, get the message into campus through organizations like this one, right? Go out and tell people things that they haven't heard before and encourage them to come along and listen. Third thing, use the power of the full interactive power of social media. You know, reassure people that there's not something wrong with them for thinking the way the majority off campus do. Right? Again, very interesting point that Jonathan Haidt made when I talked to him about his book. He said this culture of fragility is an Anglosphere phenomenon. And the reason he thought, the primary reason for that is that most universities in English-speaking countries are ultimately modelled on Oxford and Cambridge in the sense that they are residential and elite. Okay, so the madness that he writes about does not happen in technical colleges, by and large, and doesn't happen in places of adult education. To have your mind turned by the Great Awakening, you need to be segregated. You need to be put with a bunch of other people who think that way. It can't survive regular contact with your amused parents or your amused workmates, right? They drag you back to the real world. So there is a function for the people to be churning out the videos and the clips and to remind everyone else of what the real world is, right? And of how weird and perverse some of these doctrines are. And then the final thing, and I think this is really critically important, is we should be doing more to prepare kids immediately before they go up. I spent last summer teaching at a summer school for, I mean, it was people kind of between the lower sixth and the sixth form in Old Money, right? So people who were about to go into their A-level year. And the guy who ran, it was a really, really good outfit called the John Locke Institute, run by an Australian academic called Martin Cox. And he had this idea that he really wanted every student to pick up. And he called it generous listening. And it's such a brilliant concept. He said, the thing about generous listening is it doesn't mean just being quiet while the other guy talks. It doesn't mean just waiting to pounce in with your response, right? And nor does it mean grabbing some loose word in his argument, which means that you can win the argument even when you're wrong. Generous listening means properly put yourself into his shoes. Try and see where he's coming from. Try and see what the motivation is for what he's saying. Don't infer bad motives. And then if you still disagree with him at the end, engage with his strongest argument, not with his weakest one. You know, and he kept hammering this in. And at the opening session, he said, look, if you haven't changed your minds on at least 2 or 3 big issues over the couple of weeks you're here, I will have failed. Right? Now, it was a great heterodox group of people. There were Marxists and Muslims. There were libertarians and socialists. There, you know, people from every country, But it worked in the sense that everyone listened respectfully and tried to understand other points of view. Now, this is the point I was making in my main talk. That does not come naturally to us. The much more intuitive way of looking at the world is, this is the truth, and if he can't see it, he's either a liar or a fool, because there it is. How can he be looking at the same facts as me and not see what I'm seeing, right? That comes much more naturally to us. We have to learn not to do that. We have to learn this really difficult idea that everyone has a different perspective, right? And if we did that more, then I think people would be in a much stronger position. You don't teach free speech, you model it. Right? People do not become free speech defenders because you have given them a reading list that includes, John Milton and J.S. Mill. They become free speech habitués because they have been exposed to a climate where that is normal and natural, and where there is something jarring and dissonant and discourteous about trying to shout down someone that you disagree with. And that's the culture we've got to try and rebuild. And we should start in schools, because at the moment, we focus so much of this on the campus craziness. But the more I see of the state of some of our state secondary schools, the more I realize that we have to go a lot more upstream.
Right, so this will be our last question.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for coming down. It was a really interesting talk. So when I'm within conversations with people that are on the left, this is kind of two questions really. And also if you look at like Bernie Sanders in America, he looks at examples such as Scandinavia and how we should move more towards that kind of system. So my question is, what do you feel about these kind of social democracies? And my second question is, what do you feel about cooperatives? Do you think that they have a place in a free market society?
Cooperatives as in, I mean, as in what, insurance, or as in like the...
No, it's in workers having a share within a company.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, I'll deal quickly with the second one. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is sometimes the right model. It depends on the company, and it's up to them. And there are examples of where it's been very successful, right? And my philosophy of limited government is that it's not for politicians to tell people what the best model is. They will work it out themselves, you know, and they won't always get it right. Freedom includes the freedom to fail. But provided that there is diversity and heterogeneity, the bad models generally will be driven out by the good ones. That's, you know, that's how the system works. In terms of socialism and Scandinavia, that's a very good question, Edward. It's amazing how these national stereotypes last for decades after they've ceased to apply. You know, I mean, how many times have you been abroad and you've been told that Britain is famous for its terrible food? And I think this is a wartime rationing thing. I mean, you know, I mean, maybe if you're talking to someone from someone from Japan or something where the cuisine is very different, okay. But when I hear this from, say, Americans, I mean, American food is good and bad in precisely the same way that British food is good and bad, right? And it's not a prejudice that can survive living here, and yet people absolutely cling to this idea. So in the same way people will tell you that, you know, Germans are a militaristic and expansion. They are the most right-on pacifist nation in the world, right? You know, but people are still stuck in this because the stereotype takes on a life of its own. And one of the most extreme examples of this is the myth of socialist Scandinavia. You know, does anyone know who the Prime Minister, you know, let's look at some of the recent governing parties in the Nordic world. I mean, to take one outlier, since 1945, Iceland has been under semi-permanent Thatcherite government with the Independence Party as by far the dominant party, right? If we're looking at the Nordic world as a whole, you won't find a much more free market-oriented country than Iceland. One of the main reasons they didn't want to join the EU, they thought it was a corporatist racket. So, you know, be careful about making generalizations. But even in I mean, the level of state expenditure in Norway is below what it is in Britain. They sometimes have social democrats and they sometimes have conservatives in government, like in Sweden, like in Denmark, like in Finland. But they have incredibly Thatcherite employment laws. They have fairly balanced budgets. They have, in the case of Sweden, they've got a brilliant system that we could really learn from, where the pension age is tied to longevity. So instead of having this nightmare that the rest of the world is going through of trying to find a way of raising the pension age to take account of the good news that we're all living longer, that happens automatically there through actuarial calculation. They have effectively voucher schools in Sweden. You know, if by socialist you mean controlling the means of production, distribution, and exchange, Scandinavia is not socialist. Nowhere near socialist. Scandinavia is all of the Nordic countries are capitalist countries with relatively generous welfare states. So if that's what Bernie Sanders wanted, fine, but that isn't what he wants. He actually wants socialism, right? But I'll tell you what is unquestionably a country where there was state control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange: Venezuela. Right? That was absolute textbook communism. A socialist party got in, nationalized the main economic organs, and then ended up having to use coercive force to repress the opposition. It was just like everywhere, like Cuba, in fact, anyway, any communist, Angola, Czechoslovakia, Benin, Cambodia, you name it, right? And they always follow the same pattern, don't they? And Chavez was a classic example of this. First, it's the brave new dawn. With Nicaragua, we had it with Cuba, we had it with Venezuela, we had it with Mao's China, we even had it with Russia. I've seen the future and it works. Right? And then you have stage 2, which is, okay, this is not working out so well. It's because of American sabotage. Right? There's still the determination to cling, right? And I remember getting this all the time in the European Parliament about Venezuela. The CIA is undermining their economy, right? And I mean, quite apart from the sort of, I would always respond by saying, okay, let's just discuss how we would do it. Okay, I'm a CIA guy. Okay, my job is to undermine the Venezuelan economy, right? I get to work, I switch on my laptop. Now what do I do? Right? How do you actually go about that? I mean, it's kind of, you know. And then there's the final stage. Oh, no, that was a lol. Why are you going about Venezuela? That was never socialist, you know. Real socialism has never been tried, which is always what it comes back to. Real socialism has never yet been tried. Well, try applying that sophistry to any other ideology. Imagine saying, oh, come on, you can't judge fascism by those 1930s regimes that called themselves fascists. Real fascism has never been tried, right? I mean, it is an absolutely preposterous argument, and yet somehow the left managed to get away with this, and they're allowed to get away with this extraordinary double standard, where they are allowed to treat socialism as a textbook theory, but to judge market capitalism by its necessarily imperfect real-world shortcomings. And I think you have to judge like with like. You know, I mean, yes, of course, pure, perfect, platonic socialism can't be tried any more than perfect capitalism can be tried, right? In every capitalist country there are interventions and state distortions. But I think we are at least fair-minded enough to say Thatcher's Britain was more capitalist than what had gone before, and we will take the good and the bad and stand in defense of that, right? And that's we recognize it as our system. You know, South Korea is more capitalist than North Korea, and it may not be perfect, but we will at least infer some of the positives and negatives and take that as what we mean by capitalism. The other side never accepts it. Never accepts that socialism has ever happened anywhere, and yet continues to insist that it's the solution to everything. And that in itself ought to tell us everything that we need to know about socialism, right? If it's never capable of implementation. What was it that Ronald Reagan used to say? Communism will only work in 2 places: heaven, where they don't need it, and hell, where they've already got it.